Um, since my MA, I've been working on textiles of the Abbasid and Fatimid Caliphs. And so it's a subject that has been with me for a very long time. It's interesting because these textiles had really not received much attention before. Various scholars like Ernst Kuhnel, Richard Ettinghausen, Carl Johann Lamm, for example, had worked on this, but there'd never been an overall view of these textiles, and nobody collected all the information available on the dated pieces, and so that's what I attempted to do in my doctorate. And so what we're seeing tonight is a sort of very short summary, a brief look into the history of early Islamic inscribed textiles, which are commonly known as tiras, which is a term that the etymology of which is debated. It's not exactly, it's always been thought to mean embroidery, but in fact in the early Islamic period, as we'll see a little bit later, it referred to an inscription band, which could have been applied to textiles or other objects as well. And we'll come to that a bit later. So this is sort of your typical tiras textile. It looks like really not very much, but in fact contains a wealth of information on its patron, place of production, workshop, and also date, and dates are very rare in Islamic art. So these are really up there with coins, for example, and papyri that are dated. And they give you quite an interesting insight into procedure, into the way textiles functioned not only as items of usage, but also as documents. So what we're looking at really, let's see, the world of the Abbasid Empire, the Umayyads, early Islamic world, really stretched from the Mediterranean all the way to Central Asia and also parts of India, and was a very vibrant region with a lot of trade going back and forth. And a lot of that trade went through Cairo, and also here, Khorasan, which was on the Silk Road. Cairo really benefited from its location here between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, which opened up the sea routes to India and also to China. And the land route here from Central Asia also led to the Mediterranean via northern Iran and Anatolia. So these are really important areas. And Umayyad Caliphate had its seat here in Damascus, and then later the Abbasids made their capital in Baghdad. So this was sort of, global, pretty much global trade going on. I mean, this was, there was long-distance trade that was affecting this region. And so the textiles that we see coming out of Egypt reflect that, and we'll look at that a bit later. But what do we really know about textiles? This is sort of the extension here all the way to China, and a lot of the trade went through the Straits of Malacca and the southern Chinese Sea here. And shipwrecks have shown that from the Tang period, an Arabian dhow was found here on the shores of Malaysia that dated from the 9th century, that was carrying goods that were destined for the Middle Eastern market. So this is sort of our extension here. So what do we really know about medieval textiles? Well, the problem is that most of the textiles that we have today were recovered in excavations. And so, to some extent, they only reflect to what was deposited in those excavations. And so, they probably don't reflect the wealth and the breadth of textiles that were used. And the wealth of these, of textiles that we that we know of really has been reported in literary sources. For example, the Geniza documents from Cairo, which were trade documents that were found, which were trade documents of the Jewish community in Cairo that were found in a niche of the synagogue in Old Cairo. Hundreds and hundreds, in fact probably thousands of little documents, papyri, paper, parchment that contain letters, accounts, exchange bills, payment bills, and all of these things which give us quite a good idea of the variety of things which went from place to place, from Spain to Egypt, from Egypt to India, and so forth. The colorants that were imported to Egypt, the types of textiles, for example, silks, cottons, local linens, but the problem is that very little of that is actually extant in the archaeological evidence, and that we will have a look at that later. Another way to approach this question is by looking at the visual evidence, and we've got, for example, in the paintings of Samarra, the Abbasid capital, for about 50 years in the 9th century. Sashes like these, for example, scarves, long dresses. They're not terribly informative, in fact, but they were patterned. And they're surely, this is a black and white, but very colorful. Color is one constituent of Islamic textiles that is very, very important. And we see that much better here in the famous paintings of the maqamat of al-Hariri, which date from the mid-13th century, or the early 13th century, from before the Mongol conquest. And there we've got these turbaned scholars sitting in the library discussing matters of scholarship and wearing these long robes which have bands with inscriptions on the sleeves. And this is what we would normally call a tiraz band. And there's some more here. You can see how they are inscribed, in fact. And then the different types of, this is a very, very colorful fabric here. Some of them are more colorful than others. This is another one here, and another one there. And he's also got these something here going on his trousers. And there is, for example, a cloth that's covering the throne on which he's sitting. Has also got one of those bands. And then standards, coverings for horses. And some more here, standards that are inscribed, La ilaha illallah, for example. And turbans that have these little, made up of long strips of cloth that are inscribed here on the borders, and so forth. I could go on forever here. This is a figure from Iran or Afghanistan in the Metropolitan Museum, which quite nicely shows these inscribed bands on the sleeves of this cloak here. And the cloak was once very colorful in red and lapis blue and gold. Now, this text, this beautiful coat here, or thobe perhaps we should call it, is in the al-Sabah collection, and it is one of the very rare garments that has survived intact. There is another one in the Ashmolean Museum, which has been carbon dated to the 11th, early 12th century, and the material is linen, which indicates that it came from Egypt. Now, this is important because we don't have a lot of these. It was probably also recovered in a burial, and it's suggested by the staining here. But it's marvelous that this has survived intact, because we can study, for example, the type of collar that was used here, the little buttons, for example, that are still remnant there. And then, of course, also the quite sumptuous calligraphic embroidery here, which in this case is really a repeat and is not a historical inscription. But it shows you roughly the sort of thing I've been talking about by looking at the paintings that we've just seen. And there are some details there. These were photographed by Muhammad Ali in the collection, who is a great photographer. There's a little button somewhere up here, I can't see now. It's sort of fastened like that around the neck. And this is a detail of the embroidered inscription. And it was probably applied after the garment had been tailored, because it covers the seams at certain places. And these are two other pieces that I know of. There's one in the Textile Museum. It's a little children's tunic with an inscription that is of historical importance and dates from the times of the Abbasid Caliphs. And this is a little Fatimid one here in the University Museum of Cairo University. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to take a photograph, so I just drew it. So that's about it. And unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of the Ashmolean piece. So those are, well, 4 pieces that we have. So most of them look like that, you know, wonderfully eaten up, circular-shaped hole in it. It's quite well preserved here, perhaps, but this is the state in which this is quite a good state of preservation. A lot of these textiles are in a terrible state of preservation, eaten up, decomposed, stained with decomposed organic fluids, and often so badly preserved that we can't read the inscriptions properly. But there's a reason for that, and to that I will come later. So let's have a look at what a Tiraz inscription is. And as I said earlier, early authors talk about Tiraz inscriptions as being part of a whole group of inscriptions that are applied to objects that were produced under the auspices and supervision of the caliphal administration. And so they reflect, in a way, administrative procedure on a public level. And it's a bit like today, you know, when you issue a purchase requisition and it goes to here and there, and at some point the item is made, and then it comes back and goes through all the different stages yet again to be delivered to its author. And I don't think it was that different then. And as we all know, all the administrators of us know, it can be very complicated. And I think that's what's happening here as well. This one, for example, is a papyrus from Egypt, which, an Umayyad papyrus, which mentions the word tiraz on it. It says, fi tiraz. And so this obviously wasn't a textile workshop. It was a workshop producing papyri for the Umayyad administration. as a writing material, and it was state-controlled. This is in Cairo. It's published by Groman, the German scholar. And then, of course, the coinage. Coinage is part of that realm. Coins obviously had to be minted by and authorized by the ruler's administration. Not everyone could mint coins. It's just like today. You're not supposed to reproduce banknotes. Otherwise, we'd all be very rich. And so that is the case here as well. So, for example, these coins here from the Umayyad period introduce terms that identify Islam and the Shahada, for example, here. And this kind of coinage was introduced by the Umayyad Caliph Abdul Malik after abolishing the earlier Byzantine type of coin. And that was a decisive step. And then, interestingly, we also find it on tiraz, we find it on ceramics. And this is the only one that we know of. But it's on this ewer, which has been dated to the 11th, 12th century. But I actually think this is Umayyad because of the decoration, these molded jewel-like decorations here, which conform in many ways to the Umayyad period. But also, when we look closer to the inscription, this clearly isn't an Abbasid inscription. I think that is really an early Umayyad inscription here. And it was made in Jurjan, which was also a garrison city under the Umayyads and had a governor placed there. So I think that is, and interestingly, ceramics are also mentioned by the early authors as part of this requisitioning by the authorities. And this is a beautifully produced ceramic. So this was nothing commercial, surely. This was a very well-planned, very, very highly executed item here. Probably a water jug. And then ivory objects, for example. This one here, made for the Umayyad governor of Yemen and dated 762. And again, it's a protocolary inscription, so it follows a certain content and a certain form. And then these are Spanish ivories, and they have, again, the same sort of type of inscription inscribed on. There's a whole group of those that were produced in Madinat al-Zahra in the 10th century. And their inscriptions are remarkably close to those on the textiles that I studied from Egypt, and other objects such as the ivory pyxes that we saw before, and coin inscription, glass weights. I haven't illustrated those, but they belong to those. Now, of course, we know of inscriptions. There are a lot of inscriptions in Islamic art, in ceramics, for example. These are early ones from Iraq. This is from Nishapur here. But these follow these are commercial wares. They were produced to be consumed and so forth. So these inscriptions didn't have to follow particular protocol. This is also from Nishapur or Afraziab, Samarkand. And of course, the very important inscription which should be mentioned in the Dome of the Rock. Architectural inscriptions follow the same patterns. The inscriptions that tell you who commissioned the building, when it was built, who paid for it, and so forth. And that is also the case here in the Dome of the Rock. And this is the inscription here in the mosque in Cordoba, which really conforms in many ways. It looks back to that in the Dome of the Rock in some ways. So, and of course, the commissioning of the kiswa, and we have a number of inscriptions that are related to us by the Egyptian author al-Maqrizi, who tells us of textiles that were sent to Mecca and inscribed with the names of the Fatimid Caliphs, for example. And so to inscribe the kiswa was a prerogative of the ruler and exercised with his authority only. And of course, the endowment of Qurans as well. And so it brings us back, and I just put that in because of the analogy here. I'm not making a particular point here, but just the gold on blue sort of fit very nicely, actually. This is from the Fatimid period, and the blue Quran it's been suggested, we don't know, but it's been suggested to be from the Fatimid period, but we don't know really. That's up for debate. So let's look at the content of a Tiraz inscription, and I've chosen this one here because it's so beautifully complete. So we've got the names of rulers. We've got protocolaic formulas, such as Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, religious formulas, places of production. For example, Fi Misr, Fi Dumyat, Marv in Khorasan. Types of workshops. And we identify between two types of workshops, Tiraz, or actually three, Tiraz al-Khasa, and Tiraz al-Amma. And what they mean, I don't want to go into today because that's a huge discussion, and it's not very, very conclusive, in fact. Commissioning administrators, these are mostly financial directors, in fact, and they were working in the caliphal administration, often in Baghdad, and giving orders to the authorities in Egypt to produce certain textiles. And then, of course, the date of production. So this is usually what we, in the best scenario, what we would find. So let's have a look. Let's try and read that. So, Ni'ma min Allah. I can't remember now. That's al-Imam here. So that introduces the name of the caliph. And I'm sorry if I failed this today, but you have to be really, really tuned into this. And my eye hasn't been tuned into this for a long time now. Al-Imam al-Muqtadir billah, Amir al-Mu'minin, Atala lahu baqahu, mimma amra al-Wazir. So it's mentioned that it was ordered by the vizier. Ali bin Muhammad, yes, exactly. Bi'amalahu fi Tiraz Masr. So this was produced in the Tiraz in Cairo. Ala Yadeh, under the supervision of, actually this is Bishr. Bishr Mawla, he was referred to as a Mawla. So he was a kind of he was probably a slave in the caliphal administration and very likely to be Persian. And I can't remember if we know very much about him, but these individuals sometimes can be identified. There's one individual called Shafi al-Muqtadiri who was surely working in Baghdad, and his title is Mawla Amir al-Mu'minin, so it is quite a grand title, in fact. So these are important individuals here to be mentioned in these inscriptions. They're not lowly supervisors of the production. They are financial directors. And then the date, Sanad Tisa'in Ma'iyah. 299, that is Muqtadir, exactly, 299, because he ruled from 295 to 320. So that's a wonderful, perfect example, but they don't always look like that, and they can be really, really frustrating at times. Now, I just want to have a quick overview, over the production in various places, so you get an idea of what was produced and where. So we can identify, for example, the productions of Central Islamic lands, Egypt, Palestine, the central region around Baghdad, Khorasan, with its capital Merv and its trade emporium Nishapur, the province of Yemen, and there was also, of course, terraz were also produced in Spain. We don't have a lot of evidence for it. And there was also probably production in Sicily and also North Africa. But again, most of the evidence is from here and from there. And it spreads over from the Abbasid period all the way, or from the Umayyad period all the way to the Fatimid period. So let's have a look at North Africa. This is actually this is probably one of the earliest textiles. It has an embroidered inscription on this beautiful compound woven silk that mentions the name of the Umayyad Caliph Marwan and his title Amir al-Mu'minin, and it says Fi Terraz Ifriqiya. So that was probably produced somewhere in modern-day Tunisia. And it is possible that this textile came from somewhere else, maybe from Syria or maybe from Iran. I don't know. I'm not a great specialist on compound weaves. So, but it's certainly not a local production there. And then, so I'm sort of grouping Egypt with North Africa. This is from Egypt. This is an early textile group, belongs to a group of wool on linen textiles that were produced in Upper Egypt. And this one says Mimma. So this Lissahibihi, so it's probably a blessing to the owner, and then it's Mimma. And it probably says, it tells you where it was made from, but that's lost. Of what was ordered in so-and-so. And this is a textile here in Cleveland, which is also of Egyptian production. Again, wool on linen, so it's from Upper Egypt. Perhaps from Bahnasa, perhaps from Fayum here. These are very interesting, often colored in indigo blue, and then woven with wool and inscribed in this rather quirky script. And they tended to be shawls. And the ground material is also wool. There's a whole group of those that were made in the Fayum, and we know that because there's one item that's inscribed with the place name. And then, of course, these here, which were produced in Lower Egypt, between Cairo, Alexandria, and the Nile Delta. Embroidered and tapestry woven inscriptions in silk on linen ground. And that's a tapestry woven inscription here. And that's another tapestry woven inscription in red, rather big letters. Now, in Iraq, inscriptions look slightly different. They're much more fluid in a sense. They have a rhythm. these alifs here, for example, give you a certain rhythm of spatial composition, and then also these hastas here on the below the baseline of the script. And they tend to be a little bit more cursive as well. They embroidered in chain stitch, as opposed to Egypt, where it was usually flat stitch or back stitch that was used. With chain stitch, you can be a lot more creative because you don't have to count threads. This is one that was written on cotton with a pen. And you can see the beautiful proportions of the letters. And then compound weaves that were produced in Iran, but this is an area about which we know very little, really. So I've just put that in to show you a kind of different type of production for which Iran and Central Asia was known for. Khorasan. There we have inscriptions that are again woven in this embroidered in chain stitch, but in a style that is much more sort of condensed and more graphic, perhaps, as those of Iraq. The sort of rounded end letters here, or the memes, for example, and juxtaposed here, for example, the rounded lam alif juxtaposed with the angular ayn, for example. Now, the material of this is interesting because it's called mulham, which means it was made of silk and cotton. Cotton as the weft and silk as the warp. So the warp is set up first on the loom and the cotton is shot in. And that was a speciality of Khorasan. And then this little friend here, who I just talked about in New York last Friday, which has an inscription that mentions the fact that it was made in Nishapur. And I'm proposing that this little textile here, which looks very big on the screen, but actually is very small, in fact, suggests that we should completely reattribute a whole group of textiles that have been attributed to the Iranian city of Bishapur. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, but you can see that Nishapur and Bishapur might look very similar in Arabic if you don't have dots. And this is made of silk fabric, and again, silk, warp, cotton weft. So it conforms with the Khorasani textiles that we've seen. Well, and of course, we can't do it without this one, the famous elephant silk in the Louvre, the Suaire de Saint-Josse, which mentions the name of the Samanid governor of Khorasan, Abi Mansur Bukhtakin, and who's there? Abi Mansur Bukhtakin. And then again with the, Atalallah Aiz wa al-Iqbal lil-Qa'id. He was a governor, so it's called Qa'id here. Very sumptuous textile, incredibly expensive at its time. This would have been sort of the top notch, of production. And it survived in a church in France, which, that was me again, which it reached very likely during the Crusades. And I think probably via Constantinople, because there was a direct link between Constantinople and Khorasan. We know that because of the trade routes later in the 14th century, early 15th century, the Spanish mission of Clavijo to the court of Timur, when they traveled through on ship to the Black Sea, where they disembarked and then took the land route from the Black Sea, below the Caspian Sea, all the way to Khorasan, which is fairly straightforward. And I would have thought that this might have arrived in Constantinople the same way. It could have come via Jerusalem, of course, but I'm not sure about that. I really do think that this was something that must have come through the northern trade route between Khorasan and Constantinople. And from there, it was taken by a member of the English royal family to France and deposited in a church there, where it was used as a wrapping for the remains of Saint-Josse. And it's dated 961, because that's before 961, because that's the year when Mansour Bourtakin died. Now, this is quite significant because, I think this is a marvelous textile and absolutely fantastic. But it has a little brother, and the little brother is here in Kuwait. In fact, it is most amazing that this would have survived. I think it was about 10 years ago when I worked in the collection and I started to catalog the textiles, and I had a look at this one. There was a whole pile of textiles that was acquired by Sheikh Nasser, and that came from a cave in Afghanistan, from Samangan. And so this was a part of a convolute of textiles. They're all being recorded now and organized and conserved. And this one somehow probably didn't stand out very much. It's not a very large piece, probably about this big, about this wide, and looks rather insignificant. But it's not insignificant when you start reading the inscription. And in fact, there's our Abi Mansour Bourtakin Atalallah. And there's a little mistake, Lil-Qa'id, it's a repeat. In fact, it's exactly the same inscription that we find on the Sphère de Saint-Josse. So our little friend is a poor relation of the Sphère de Saint-Josse, a textile that was surely produced as part of a public requisition for the Samanids. And the use of its inscription obviously tells you that. But it's a completely different type of textile. It's a sort of everyday usage, something that you could have made into a shirt, for example, or an undershirt. And obviously, this item has been used and used and used, and the inscription remained because this was probably the most important thing about the whole textile. And so it's remarkable that those two have really survived, even though the history of survival is so fundamentally different. So this is a fantastic find, I think. Palestine is often forgotten, but Palestine had a very significant production of reed mats, which were used as prayer mats. And they were made in Tiberias, and we know that from a reed mat that survived in Egypt and was acquired by the collector Benaki and is now in the Benaki Museum in Athens. And there's another, and it says that it was made in Tabaria in the Tiraz al-Khasa, so in an official Tiraz workshop. And it has a very beautiful inscription. I'm sorry, I haven't got a photograph of it here, which is... there's another one in the Metropolitan Museum, which is equally fine. And so this piece here in the Al-Sabah collection conforms to this group. It is also a very fine production, and it is woven with esparto grass. And it's woven just like a normal textile. So Tiberias. And then Yemen, famous ikats that reflect Yemen's connection to the Indian Ocean, here inscribed with a painted inscription and gilded inscription. And then this is another ikat. This is in the Metropolitan Museum. And an ikat is a textile which has warp threads that are colored, that have different colors concurrent on one thread. And so they're organized in such a way that they create a pattern on the loom. This piece is in the Al-Sabah collection here. You see that a little bit better here. You know, if you go across like that, you can see that we've got brownish color, we've got this beige color, you've got blue and brown. So these are all different, same color, these are all different colors on the same thread. And then this has been embroidered on top of it here. And this is one of the earliest textiles actually from Yemen here, from the reign of al-Musta'in from 250. And it mentions its production, fi daraz bisanna. So, and then it gives the date. So that's a very, very early piece. And you can see some details here of that. It's in the Metropolitan Museum. And the way it was produced. And this one here, probably from Sana'a, but not sure. There's a bit missing here, unfortunately, but it says again, fi taraz. And it has this sort of peculiar embroidery as well here, which you also find here. Right, and India, of course. India is often forgotten, but actually textiles were imported from India to Egypt, and this is one here in the collection with an inscription that really resembles North Indian architectural inscriptions. These rather sort of quirky letters and plated and floriated Kufic. But I think there is an inscription in the mosque in Banpur, which is very similar to that. And this was block printed, which was a technique used in India and still used today. And the interesting thing is it was block printed and then was embroidered over. So the block printing was used as a guide to the embroidery. Most of the embroidery is gone now, but here the letters were obviously embroidered in red, and then the decoration here was embroidered in yellow. And that is quite early. I mean, I don't exactly know the date, but probably about 10th century, I would think. And we have very little information about India and the textile production in India at that time, other than from the imports that were found in Egypt. And this is sort of more what we find there. In fact, these block-printed textiles here in indigo. A lot of these have been found in the place called Qasr Qadim, which was a Red Sea port, and from where a lot of these textiles were then disseminated in Egypt and the Middle East. Spain, I don't want to bore you with all of this, but we've got very little information on Spain. One of the very few inscribed textiles is called the Veil of Hisham. And in a sense, I suspect here that they are copying to some extent Egyptian textiles, because those look very concurrent with what we find in the Fatimid period. And Sicily, a brilliant robe, coronation robe of the Holy Roman Empire, which states in its embroidered inscription that it was made in the Tiraz of Siqiliya. And it's dated, so roughly the time of the Fatimid Caliphs, in fact. And embroidered with pearls and gold thread. But again, we don't really know what the Islamic production in Sicily would have been. None of it has survived. So I want to just mention briefly that Egypt is the home of linen and tapestry, and that embroideries were actually was a technique that was really not that common in Egypt before the Muslim conquest, and it's very likely that embroiderers were brought in by the Abbasids from Iraq and settled in Egypt. Of course, Egypt had a very long tradition of tapestry woven textiles, going back all the way to ancient times. Particularly, it was the Copts settled in the Nile Delta and also in Upper Egypt that produced these. This is some microscopic photographs of embroideries that I took in Toronto, and they are quite instructive as to the different types of stitches used. And you can see they're all counted threads. That's Egyptian. I don't want to go through all of that because there's a lot here. Again, an Egyptian piece on counted thread. Now, that is an Eastern piece because those are this is chain stitch, and you don't need to count your threads. Therefore, you can produce a round form like that. And then tapestry, which is, again, has its home in Egypt. And this is, in fact, a little detail here from that inscription. Sorry, not from that. It's from a similar piece in Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, which shows you that it is a Coptic technique of crossing warps that is used here. And so we can actually say that these Islamic textiles were produced by Copts because of the presence of a particular Coptic technique that is also found in pre-Islamic Coptic tapestries. And it's not very clear here, but it's these crossing threads here that are locking in the tapestry. And that's, you see here, sorry, there. Well, not very clear here, it was something like that. Yeah, I don't, it's too much. Now, I'm going to skip this because we've talked about e-cuts, and I think I don't need to go back to them. But there's two e-cuts here in the Metropolitan Museum, and these two textiles, we didn't quite know where they were from. And so I worked out that they must have come from Yemen. In fact, this fringe here, then the embroidery here, and then the embroidery there. And it's actually not really, it's kind of inlaid into the ground fabric, which is a very particular technique that we've seen on textiles from Sana'a, for example. So, I mean, this is what you can do with microscopic photography. And you can, come to some conclusions as to what attribution you can give to pieces. And then, I collected a lot of this data in a database that contains all the dated pieces that I could find, and there are about 1,822, with the inscriptions, details of the technical analysis, the historical data, and this is fully searchable. And I hope that at one point this can be published on the internet. So this allows you to play with the material and to collate areas that normally are very difficult to collate and compare. Now, one of my last points really is the fact that it's the survival of these textiles. How have they survived? And what do we know about their survival? Most of them have survived archaeologically. They've been excavated. The excavations were not recorded, as so often is the case with Islamic objects. You know, in Egypt, there was a lot of illicit digging going on in the early 20th century, you know, and although the museum was trying to record things, I'm not sure that they recorded things according to modern scientific standards. I've never seen the records in Cairo, but so we don't have a lot of context really for most of these textiles. Very few have survived outside the archaeological context. Sueur de Saint-Just is, for example, one. A few little Abbasid pieces in Germany in a psalter from the medieval period is another one. There are several that have survived in a monastery in Eritrea. They were stuck into a hole in the wall because they didn't want to throw them away because there was writing on them. And those are about the only ones. So there's a pinpointed occurrences of survival outside the archaeological context. But most of the textiles give you evidence that they themselves, that is contained in themselves, that they survived in burials. They are soiled to such an extent that the fabric is eaten away and stained. And this photograph here, which I obtained from Leila Ali Ibrahim, well-known scholar of Islamic art in Cairo, whose father was present in a lot of these excavations in a place called Khadra Sharifa in the Southern Cemetery. And when I told her about my project, and she said, "Oh, you must see these photographs," and she allowed me to photograph them. So this is a corpse laid out on a stretcher where the gentleman here is examining the shroud, and the shroud is containing a band. There's somebody taking notes, and I wonder where those notes are. I hope they're still there, but I would think they might be. And there's a little close-up here showing how this gentleman does what, well, unfortunately, most of them did, cut off the piece with the band, and so the rest of it was thrown away or probably put back into the grave. I don't think it was thrown away. They were probably put back into the grave because these people, after all, then they were reburied afterwards. It was probably very questionable in the first place to exhume them, but a lot has been done for the, quest of science. So, and that explains why a lot of these textiles have such wonderfully straight cuts and concentrated on the inscriptions, like here, cut, probably laid under a head or over a head, and that area just disappeared. In fact, what she said to me was that most of the inscriptions were laid over the head, and that's very interesting. We'll come back to that a bit later in a second, because these photographs are from excavation by the French Institute in Khadra Sharifa in 1996 by Roland Pierre-Guéraud, who took the photographs. And this is very telling because what you see here is a person buried in shrouds and then laid on to a reed mat, which is then folded over so as to protect the person. And this is probably where you get all these reed mats from. And I will come to the textiles that were discovered. They contained an outer layer of a Eastern textile, either Iraqi or Khorasani, because it was mulham, consisting of silk warp, cotton weft, and this kind of inscription that we found on Iraqi pieces. Then underneath was a decorative band that dated from the Fatimid period, and then underneath that a band which contained the laqab al-Ma'ad, which could either be, I don't want to be wrong, it's very likely to be al-Mustansir. And so, but I haven't checked my laqabs tonight, so I'm not exactly sure, but it's datable to a particular Fatimid Caliph. And so you've got three different shrouds here, with one is that is definitely pre-Fatimid, and this can be dated to the 10th century, and another one that is definitely about 50, 60 years later. So it tells you that these textiles had a long life, and that to some extent they were conserved to be used in burials later. And the reason is a very interesting one. I will come to that now. Oh, there's some more photographs here, just a juxtaposition of this and that. But why in the burial? And I don't know, there's not much about burials in Islamic art, and there's of course a lot written about it in literature, but the only visual representation of an enshrouded body is here in Qasar Amra, and doesn't really tell us anything. It doesn't tell us how a body was enshrouded. Neither does this here. They don't have any bands here, so that's very peculiar. This is in the maqamat, burial scene. Well, and then, well, of course, this one here, but this doesn't tell us much either. This is actually very quite complete, and so it's not a long cloth in which a body would have been enshrouded. So this was probably worn underneath, and these here. Now, in order to understand why a textile would have been kept for such a long time, in order to be then used in a burial at much later date and far removed from the place of its production, I'm suggesting that we should look into the idea of textiles as objects of benediction, objects that transmit blessing. And an aspect of that is the khala, the robe of honor. Because the robe of honor is in fact given by the caliph to a chosen courtier. And it's a robe that signifies that this person has received the particular blessing and the particular attention of the ruler. And it's a kind of it's like almost an investiture of office. So when you are promoted, you get your robes of honor that tell everybody what rank you have now moved to. And of course, these were very precious items, and not something that you would wear every day, perhaps, and not something that you would throw away easily. Another thing is that textiles were also used as payment. So bulk, rolled up, probably. Large pieces, large lengths, loom lengths that were given to the employees of the court, of course inscribed with the name of the caliph, because they were a caliphal gift. And so you could either have them made into clothing, or you could keep them in a chest at home for a particular time to be used. So those are the sort of two types of khala. Now, the Fatimid Caliphs were not quite ordinary caliphs. They were caliphs who believed that they were descended directly from the Prophet Muhammad and that they emanated a divine aura, that they emanated sanctity and Ismailis in Egypt would often go to the palace. They would touch the gates of the palace in order to receive that barakah, that blessing. They would try to touch the clothing of the caliph in order to receive that barakah. And we know, for example, that the Fatimid Caliphs gave away pieces of clothing because of the barakah that was contained in them. And we know that they gave them away for funerary purposes because, in fact, one of the Caliph al-Mu'izz's, or the Caliph al-Mu'izz's most favorite companion, his secretary, Jawdar, wrote his biography, and in his biography he states that he asked al-Mu'izz in a letter that he should send him a few of his own garments for his own funeral. And in return, al-Mu'izz was very touched by this. In return, he sends back a letter and includes a set of garments, of outfits, in fact, that contained several garments. And he not only returned garments that belonged to himself, but also garments that belonged to the 4 caliphs that Jawdar had served. And so this was an incredible honor. And, for example, it included Mervian cloth from Merv. It included tunics, trousers, gold-lined garments, colored cloth. But there was a lot of Khorasani cloth in it, actually. They must have liked that very much. Maybe that explains, for example, why we have a Khorasani cloth in the actual burial. Now, I just want to quote you very briefly what he said in his letter back to Jawdar. "Conserve these garments until the time of which you spoke," that's his death, "after which God will have prolonged your life so that you will join us in the pilgrimage to the sacred house of God and the visit to the grave of our ancestor Muhammad, so that this will be a joy to your eyes by the grace of God to his friends, God willing." So he, in a way, he alludes to the afterlife, and he alludes to the fact that he is very close to, that Jawdar is very close to al-Mu'izz, and that he is included in the benediction that is granted by the caliph as imam of the Ismaili community. And in fact, there are several, if we look at hadith, there are several, and I don't want to go into all of this now because we don't have time, but there are several instances where the Prophet Muhammad gives away his own garments to members of his family. And those are then buried in those garments. So there is already a tradition into which the Fatimids tap into. And they do that in order to highlight their claim to be successors, the rightful successors to the imamate and the leadership of the Islamic community. So, this is a little miniature here from the Jami al-Tawarikh, which shows, it's a visual reference really to this, to what's going on, what I've been talking about. It's Joshua orders the destruction of the spoil of Jericho, and so there's Joshua, the prophet, seen here, and there is this attendant who is touching his scarf, and he is touching his scarf for his benediction. So this is kind of a visual reference to this literary phenomenon that I've just talked about. So, in a sense, I mean, this is, to round up, these textiles have survived in a very particular context. And so therefore, we cannot extrapolate from these textiles to the larger world of textiles in the early Islamic period. They give us a very specific archaeological context that existed at a very specific time. And unfortunately, we are missing all those beautiful textiles that are talked about in the sources, you know, studded with gold and pearls and diamonds, and that weighed, you know, tens of kilos. For example, the princesses of the Fatimid court were wearing such enormous robes. And, oh, I'm so sorry. Let's go back. So, there is a lot to be done, really, to kind of counterbalance this sort of very skewed picture of medieval textiles by finds that have come from the East. And the collection here has an amazing variety of archaeological textiles from Afghanistan, that were found in caves, and that give you an idea of the wealth of textiles out there that is quite a counterbalance to the Tiraz textiles that I've talked about tonight. So thank you very much indeed, and I hope it wasn't too much of a tour de force for you, but it's a little bit complicated and a little bit dry, perhaps, as a subject, but I hope that you've enjoyed it. Thank you.